The iron wheels of the locomotive screeched against the cold steel rails, sending a shudder through the wooden floorboards of the third-class carriage that rattled Eliza Munro's very bones. The whistle blew, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed off the vast, indifferent mountains looming over the town of Laramie. It was late October in the year 1882, and the Wyoming wind was already sharpening its teeth, eager to bite through the thin wool of Eliza's gray dress. She sat frozen for a moment after the train jolted to a halt, her hands, red and chapped from the biting cold of the unheated car, clutched a small, batter-worn carpetbag in her lap. It was all she had in this world, that, and the secrets she carried stitched into the lining of her soul. She took a breath, tasting the coal smoke and the crisp, thin air of the high elevation, and forced herself to stand. Her boots were worn through at the soles, and every step was a reminder of the miles she had walked in Boston before surrendering to this desperate gamble. Stepping onto the platform felt like stepping onto the surface of a different moon. The town was a collection of rough-hewn timber and dust, huddled beneath a sky so large it made her feel insignificant. Men in heavy canvas coats and wide-brimmed hats moved with purpose, their boots thudding heavily on the wooden planks. There was a rawness here, a violence in the very air that smelled of horse manure, pine, and impending snow. Eliza descended the metal stairs, the wind immediately seizing her skirts and whipping her hair across her face. She shivered violently. Her coat was little more than a rag, patched and repatched, offering no defense against the mountain chill. She felt the eyes of the town upon her almost instantly. In Boston, she had been invisible, just another fallen woman in the gray masses of the poor. Here, she was curious. Two women standing near the station master's office ceased their conversation to stare. Their gazes raked over her, noting the fraying hem of her dress, the hollows of her cheeks, and the way she held herself with a fragility that suggested she might shatter if the wind blew any harder. Eliza lowered her head, staring at the dusty toes of her boots. She knew what they saw. They saw a mail-order bride who looked more like a beggar than a wife. Silas Granger stood in the shadow of the depot overhang, a solitary figure separated from the bustle of the crowd by an invisible barrier of reputation and demeanor. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and grim, wearing a shearling coat that looked as though it had weathered a dozen winters. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that might have been handsome once, before grief and the harsh western sun had carved deep lines around his mouth and eyes. He watched the woman step off the train. The letter she had written to him had been written in a neat, careful hand, promising a hard worker who knew her place and required little. It had not been mentioned that she would arrive looking like a ghost. He saw the way the station master's wife pursed her lips in disdain. He heard the low murmur of two ranch hands nearby, joking about the quality of goods shipped from the east. A familiar, cold anger stirred in Silas's chest. He did not care for the woman. He did not know her, but he cared even less for the cruelty of a town that thrived on judgment. He stepped out from the shadows. His boots crunched on the gravel, a heavy, rhythmic sound that silenced the two ranch hands instantly. Silas ignored them. He walked straight to where Eliza stood shivering, her knuckles white against the handle of her bag. Eliza saw the large boot stop in front of her and looked up, craning her neck. The man before her was terrifying in his size and silence. His eyes were the color of slate, hard and unreadable, but they lacked the lecherous gleam she had learned to fear in the city. "Are you Eliza Munro?" His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I am." Silas did not smile. He did not offer a hand to shake. Instead, he shrugged off his heavy shearling coat. The movement was swift and fluid. Before Eliza could protest, he draped the heavy garment over her shoulders. It was still warm from his body and smelled of tobacco, leather, and horses. The weight of it nearly buckled her knees, but the warmth was instant and overwhelming. "Come with me," he said, turning away without waiting to see if she followed. "The wagon is this way." Eliza clutched the lapels of the giant coat, pulling it tighter around her throat, and hurried to keep up with his long strides. She kept her head down, but she could feel the burning stares of the townsfolk as she passed. She was the beggar bride, and he was the widower of Black Creek, a man rumored to have a heart made of stone. Together, they were a spectacle. He lifted her bag into the bed of a sturdy buckboard wagon, then turned to help her up. His hands were enormous, the skin rough and calloused like old bark. He gripped her waist to hoist her onto the seat, and for a fleeting second, she felt the immense, restrained power in his grip. He placed her on the bench as if she were a sack of grain, effective but entirely devoid of tenderness. Silas climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The two black draft horses lurched forward, and they left the judgment of the platform behind, heading out into the open country. The ride was an exercise in endurance. The wind did not abate. It only grew fiercer as they moved away from the shelter of the town buildings. Eliza sat huddled in Silas's coat, her eyes wide as she took in the landscape. She had never seen anything like it. The plains stretched out in an endless ocean of gold and sage, broken only by the jutting spine of the mountains that tore into the sky. It was a violent, breathtaking beauty. The scale of it made her chest ache. In the city, the horizon was always blocked by brick and soot. Here, the world felt boundless, and that boundlessness was terrifying. It meant there was nowhere to hide. Silas said nothing for the first hour. He drove with an easy competence, his eyes scanning the fence lines and the distant herds of cattle. He seemed a part of this land, as rugged and unyielding as the granite outcrops they passed. Eliza cleared her throat, the sound small against the wind. "How far is the ranch, Mr. Granger?" Silas did not look at her. "Another hour, maybe more with this wind." She nodded, retreating into the coat. Silence stretched between them again, thick and heavy. She felt she should say something, express gratitude, or perhaps ask about his home, but the wall he had erected around himself was palpable. He sat beside her, yet he felt miles away. Eventually, Silas spoke, his voice cutting through the silence without preamble. "You understand the arrangement, Miss Monroe?" Eliza straightened her spine. "I do. I have no need for a companion," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the road between the horse's ears. "I have a ranch to run. It is a large operation. I need someone to keep the house, cook the meals for myself and the hands, and ensure the domestic affairs are in order. My last housekeeper left to get married 6 months ago, and the place has fallen into disarray. I am not afraid of hard work." "Sir," Eliza said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength, "I have worked in sculleries and factories. I can clean and cook." "Good," Silas said. He finally glanced at her, a brief, assessing look that stripped away any pretense. "And you understand the rest?" Eliza felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She gripped her hands together under the coat. "That this is a marriage in name, that it is practical. It is for propriety," Silas said, his voice hardening. "A single woman cannot live on a ranch full of men without scandal, and I will not have my business impacted by gossip. We will marry to silence the tongues in town. You will have a roof, food, and my protection. I will have a house that is not falling apart, that is all. Do not expect affection. Do not expect me to play the husband in anything but the title. I expect nothing. Mr. Granger," Eliza said quietly. The words were true. She had learned long ago that expectation was the mother of disappointment. "I only want a place where I can be safe, where I can work." Silas nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. "Then you will have that." They turned off the main road onto a rutted track that wound upward toward the foothills. As the sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long, violet shadows across the snow-dusted grass, the ranch came into view. It was massive. A sprawling main house built of heavy logs and stone sat on a rise, overlooking a valley dotted with barns, corrals, and bunkhouses. Smoke curled from the chimney, but the windows were dark, looking like unseeing eyes. It was a kingdom, Eliza realized, and he was the lonely king. Silas halted the wagon in front of the main house. He helped her down with the same impersonal efficiency as before and led her inside. The interior was cavernous and cold. The air smelled of stale ash and neglect. Dust coated the heavy oak furniture, and the curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the dying light. It was a house that had forgotten how to be a home. "The kitchen is through there," Silas said, pointing to a dark doorway. "Your room is at the top of the stairs, the first door on the right. Mine is at the end of the hall." "We do not disturb one another's sleep." Eliza nodded, clutching her bag. "Thank you, Mr. Granger." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment, the mask slipped. She saw a flash of exhaustion so profound it frightened her. He looked like a man who had been walking carrying a heavy stone for 1,000 miles. "There is stew on the stove," he said gruffly, turning away. "It is likely cold. Eat what you want. I have work to do in the barn." He left her standing in the dark hallway, the sound of the heavy front door closing echoing like a cell door slamming shut. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small white church in town. It was a Tuesday, a gray morning with snow flurries dancing in the air. Eliza wore a dress she had found in a trunk in the spare room, a navy blue wool that was slightly too large in the waist, but far warmer than her own rags. Silas had told her to take it. He had not said who it belonged to, but the way he looked away when she walked into the room told her enough. It belonged to her, the wife he had lost. The ceremony was brief and devoid of joy. The pastor, a man with tired eyes and a Bible that was falling apart at the binding, rushed through the verses as if he were afraid the groom might change his mind. Silas stood stiffly beside her, his hat held in his hands. He wore a dark suit that smelled of cedar, his hair slicked back. He did not look at Eliza. He stared at the floorboards near the altar, his jaw set so tight a muscle feathered in his cheek. When it came time to say the vows, his voice was barely audible. Silas, take thee, Eliza." Eliza's voice was clearer, though it trembled. She promised to honor and obey, knowing that in this arrangement, obedience was the currency she paid for survival. There were no rings exchanged. Silas simply nodded to the pastor when it was done, placed a few coins in the poor box, and turned to leave. As they walked down the aisle and out onto the steps, Eliza felt the weight of the town's gaze again. A group of women stood near the general store across the street, their breath misting in the cold air as they whispered behind gloved hands. "Look at her," one woman murmured loud enough to be heard. "Thin as a rail. She won't last the winter. I heard he picked her from a catalog like a prize heifer." Another chuckled darkly, though a heifer would have more meat on its bones. Silas stiffened beside her. He stopped on the bottom step, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the women. They fell silent instantly, scattering like startled birds. He placed a hand on the small of Eliza's back, not in affection, but to steer her toward the wagon. "Ignore them," he said under his breath. "They have nothing better to do than chew on other people's misery." Eliza climbed into the wagon, her face burning. She felt small and tawdry, a piece of property acquired to sweep floors and mend socks. But as she looked at Silas's profile, hard and unyielding against the gray sky, she realized his anger wasn't directed at her. It was a shield, however spiked and rusty, that he held up against the world. Life on the Granger ranch settled into a rhythm of silence and labor. The ranch was a world unto itself, populated by men who spoke little and worked hard. Silas was the center of it, a sun around which everything orbited, but a sun that gave no warmth. He was up before dawn and gone until after dark, riding the fence lines, managing the herd, driving himself with a relentless fury. For Eliza, the transition was brutal. She had claimed to know hard work, and she did, but the work of a Boston scullery maid was different from the demands of a Wyoming ranch. The sheer physical scale of the chores overwhelmed her. The water had to be pumped from the well and hauled in heavy buckets to the kitchen. The wood for the stove had to be carried from the pile outside, leaving splinters in her soft hands. The dust in the house was relentless, blowing in through every crack in the logs. The first week was a series of failures. She burned the biscuits because the wood stove ran hotter than the coal ovens she was used to. She tripped carrying a bucket of milk, spilling it across the porch, earning a collective groan from the ranch hands who had been waiting for their supper. The men were skeptical of her. They were a rough bunch, loyal to Silas but wary of this city woman who looked like a stiff breeze would blow her away. The foreman, an older man named Jeb with a mustache that drooped below his chin, watched her with crinkled, doubtful eyes. "You sure you can handle that axe, ma'am?" Jeb asked one afternoon as Eliza struggled to split kindling, the heavy axe wobbling in her grip. Eliza gritted her teeth, sweat causing her hair to stick to her forehead. "I can manage. Mr. Jeb, thank you." She swung the axe. It glanced off the log and buried itself in the dirt. Jeb sighed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Just don't cut your foot off. The boss would have my hide if you bled out on the woodpile." But Eliza did not give up. She possessed a stubbornness that had been forged in the fires of poverty. She practiced with the stove until she understood its temper. She hauled water until her shoulders screamed and her palms were blistered and raw. She rose an hour before the men to ensure the coffee was hot and strong when they walked into the kitchen. The turning point came 2 weeks after her arrival. The main water pump in the kitchen had frozen overnight. The men were grumbling, expecting a cold breakfast and no coffee. Silas was already gone, having ridden out early to check on a heifer in distress. Eliza looked at the frozen pump. She didn't panic. She remembered watching her father, years ago, fix a similar mechanism in the parsonage. She grabbed a heavy wrench and a kettle of boiling water from the fire. She wrapped rags around the pipe, poured the water slowly to thaw the metal, and then dismantled the valve housing to clear the ice blockage. When Jeb walked in 10 minutes later, expecting disaster, he found Eliza covered in soot and water, but the pump was working, and the smell of frying bacon filled the air. She was tightening the last bolt with a strength he didn't know she possessed. "Coffee is ready," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And there are biscuits. I didn't burn them this time." Jeb looked at the pump, then at the food, and finally at Eliza. He took off his hat, scratching his bald head. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. He sat down at the long wooden table. "Pass the biscuits, Mrs. Granger." It was the first time anyone had called her by that name with anything resembling respect. But the days of small victories were followed by nights of crushing loneliness. When the sun went down and the work was done, the silence of the house became a living thing. Silas would retreat to his study or sit on the porch, smoking a pipe in the darkness. He never invited her to join him. They ate dinner in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of silverware and the crackling of the fire. He would ask about the supply list or the condition of the larder, and she would answer efficiently. There was no laughter, no sharing of the day's burdens. After the dishes were washed and put away, Eliza would climb the stairs to her room. It was a sparse space, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe. It was cold, despite the quilt she piled on the bed. Every night, she would lock the door, not because she feared Silas would enter, but because she needed to contain the grief that she held at bay during the daylight hours. She would sit on the edge of the bed and reach into the bottom of her carpet bag, retrieving a small, silver locket. It was tarnished and scratched, a cheap trinket she had bought with pennies saved from washing laundry. Inside was a tiny, hand-tinted daguerreotype of a baby, a boy. He had barely lived 6 months. The fever had taken him in a damp, crowded room in Boston, where the air was thick with coal dust and despair. She had named him Samuel. Eliza would run her thumb over the cold glass, tracing the ghostly outline of his face. The pain was a physical weight in her chest, a hollow ache that felt as vast as the Wyoming sky. She had left Boston to escape the memories, to escape the shame of being an unwed mother, a fallen woman whose child was buried in a pauper's grave. But grief had followed her across the continent. Tears would come, hot and silent at first, then turning into racking sobs that she tried to stifle with her pillow. She cried for Samuel. She cried for the innocence she had lost. She cried for the cold, loveless marriage she had trapped herself in, simply to survive. Downstairs, on the porch, Silas sat in a rocking chair that he never rocked. The night air was freezing, dipping well below zero, but he didn't feel it. He wore his coat, His pipe unlit in his hand, he could hear her. The house was well built, but sound carried through the floorboards. He heard the muffled sobs drifting down from the room above. He knew the sound of that grief. He knew the rhythm of it, the way it started slow and then broke you apart. He looked out at the dark shapes of the mountains. 5 years ago, in a winter just like this one, he had sat in this same chair and listened to the silence where his wife's voice used to be. He had listened to the wind howl over the snow that covered his son's small body. He wanted to go upstairs. A part of him, the part that was not yet dead, wanted to knock on her door and offer a handkerchief, a word of comfort. He wanted to tell her that the pain doesn't go away, but you grow strong enough to carry it. But he remained frozen in the chair. He was terrified. He was terrified that if he engaged with her grief, he would wake on his own. He was terrified that if he offered comfort, she might look at him with hope, and he had no hope left to give. He was a man who destroyed the things he loved. He had failed his first family. He would not drag this woman down with him. So Silas Granger sat in the cold, listening to his wife cry, his own eyes dry and burning, while the snow began to fall softly, burying the world in white. The first sign of the storm came not as snow, but as a change in the light. The sharp, blue-cast sky of a high-country morning turned a flat, bruised gray by noon. The wind, which had been a constant, restless presence, died completely, leaving an unnatural, ringing silence. Eliza felt it in the kitchen. The air pressure seemed to drop, making her feel heavy and short of breath. She looked out the window over the dry sink, watching the cattle in the near pasture huddle together, their backs to the north. Jeb, the foreman, stamped the mud from his boots on the porch and entered without knocking, his hat in his hand. "Boss," he said, his voice clipped. "It is here. The barometer has fallen off the wall." Silas was already moving from his study, pulling on his heavy coat. He had seen it too. He had smelled it, a metallic taste in the air. "How long?" Silas asked. "Before nightfall. And it will be a bad one," Jeb said. "I am taking the men to move the herd into the sheltered valley. We will be lucky to get back to the bunkhouse." Silas nodded. "See to it." He turned to Eliza. His eyes were not on her, but on the pantry behind her. "We will need wood. All of it. And water." Before he could finish, Eliza had already grabbed her own threadbare coat and the heavy wool blanket Silas had left on a chair. "I will fetch the wood from the lean-to. You should fill the extra barrels from the pump before it freezes." Silas paused, his hand on the door latch. He had expected her to be frightened, to cower. He was prepared to give her a list of orders, but she was already moving, her face pale but set in grim determination. This was not the broken-down woman from the train platform. This was a woman who understood survival. He gave a single, curt nod. "Do it!" For the next 3 hours, they worked in a silent, frantic race against the sky. The first flakes began to drift down, fat and lazy, as Silas worked the iron handle of the pump, filling barrel after barrel until the kitchen and porch were crowded with them. Eliza made trip after trip to the woodpile, her arms aching as she hauled logs and stacked them by the hearth in the main room and the stove in the kitchen. Her hands, already raw, split in the freezing air, and she left small smears of blood on the rough bark. She secured the shutters on the windows, stuffing rags into the cracks to block the inevitable drafts. She checked the larder, her mind moving with a cold. Clear efficiency. Smoked hams, sacks of flour, beans, coffee, lard. They would not starve. By 4 o'clock, the world disappeared. The lazy flakes turned into a driving, horizontal wall of white. The wind returned with a demonic howl, shrieking around the corners of the log house like a living thing. Silas came in from a final check of the barn, his eyebrows and mustache frozen solid. He slammed the heavy oak door and dropped the bar into place. The sound was deafeningly final. He stood in the hallway, snow melting in puddles around his boots. Eliza was in the kitchen, lighting the lamps. The weak yellow light pushed back against the screaming gray outside the windows. He could not see the bunkhouse, though it was only 100 yards away. They were cut off. The ranch hands were safe, but they were in their world, and he was in this one. With her, The first 2 days were a siege. The wind never stopped. It was a constant, high-pitched scream that wormed its way into the house, making the flames in the fireplace gutter and dance. Snow piled in drifts against the windows, plunging the house into a perpetual twilight. The world shrank to the four walls of the main room, lit only by the fire and a single lamp. They lived in a truce of silence, orbits carefully maintained. Silas sat in his high-backed chair by the fire, mending a leather bridle, his hands methodical and strong. He would work for an hour, then rise, check the bar on the front door, and stare into the white void outside before returning to his seat. Eliza claimed the kitchen. She baked bread, the smell of yeast and baking flour, a small, domestic rebellion against the chaos outside. She cleaned the house with a meticulous fury, scrubbing floors that were already clean, polishing silver that had not been used in years. They ate their meals at the long table in silence. The food was good, hot and filling, but they tasted none of it. On the third night, the storm found its peak. The house groaned under the weight of the snow on its roof. The temperature, Silas guessed, was at least 30 below zero. The cold was a physical entity, pressing against the logs, seeping through the floorboards. Eliza built up the fire in the main room, but the cold crept into her small bedroom upstairs until her breath plumed in the air. She lay under 3 quilts, shivering so violently she could not sleep. The silence between them had become almost as loud as the wind. It was a silence full of ghosts, of unspoken words, of 2 pasts that sat at the table with them. Eliza finally could not bear it. She rose, wrapped a quilt around her shoulders, and walked downstairs. Silas was not in his chair. He was standing at the front window, his shoulder pressed against the frosted glass, a tin cup of whiskey in his hand. He was staring out at the white, but he was seeing something else entirely. "You should be in bed." His voice was rough, scraping the silence. "It is too cold," Eliza said, her teeth chattering. "The embers in my stove are dead." He did not turn. He just nodded, taking a swallow of the whiskey. She hesitated, then walked slowly toward the hearth and sat on the braided rug, pulling her knees to her chest. She held her hands out to the flames. They sat that way for nearly an hour. The only sounds were the shriek of the wind and the crackle of the logs. "This storm," Silas said finally, his voice so low she almost missed it. "It is the same." Eliza looked at his reflection in the dark glass. "The same as what?" He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. "The one that took them." He said. Eliza held her breath. He had never spoken of them. The town whispered. Jeb had hinted, but Silas kept that door bolted shut. "My wife, Mary," he said, his voice flat, recounting a story he had told himself 1,000 times. "And my son, Silas Jr. He was 4. He turned from the window and walked to the fireplace, standing over her, his shadow swallowing her. He looked down into the flames. It was 5 years ago, almost to the day. The fever came on fast, hit Mary first, then the boy. I sent Jeb to the doctor in Laramie, but the snow had already started. He did not make it 2 miles before the horse foundered. He drank the last of the whiskey. They burned for 2 days. The fever. I had nothing, no quinine, nothing but snow water and blankets. I sat right here, in this room, and I listened to them. I listened to my son calling for me. I listened to my wife. Stop calling. He closed his eyes. The muscles in his jaw were knots. When the fever broke, they were cold. I sat with them for a day. The storm was just like this, so loud you could not hear yourself think. I could not even go out to dig. I had to wait. He gasped for a breath, the confession tearing out of him. I waited. I should have done something. I should have torn the barn down for wood. I should have shot a horse and wrapped them in the hide. I should have done something, but I just sat here. I let the storm beat me. He sank into his chair, the heavy frame groaning under his weight. He stared at his empty hands. I am the reason they are gone. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow. Eliza looked at this large, broken man, a man the whole territory feared, and saw the guilt that was eating him alive. She saw the same raw, jagged grief that lived in her own chest. She wanted to tell him about Samuel. She wanted to tell him about the damp room in Boston, the rattle in a tiny chest, the smell of sickness and coal smoke. But the words would not come. Her shame was a different kind. A dirty, secret shame. This was a tragedy. Hers, the world would call a sin. Instead, she moved from the floor and sat in the small wooden chair opposite him. She said, her voice trembling but clear, "I do not know what it is to lose a wife, or a son you have watched grow, but I know what it is to fail someone." He looked at her, his eyes hollow. "You look at me, Mr. Granger, and you see a woman who came here for food and shelter. You see a woman from a workhouse, and you are not wrong, but I am not as pure as you think I am. I am not the good, simple woman you bargained for." Silas studied her face, the firelight catching the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes. He saw the truth of her words, and he saw the lie of them. She was not simple, but he was beginning to think she was good. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble. "We all got sins out here, Mrs. Granger. This land does not care what you were back east. It only cares what you are now, and it has a way of scouring a person clean, or burying them." Eliza felt something shift in her, a small, painful loosening around her heart. He had not flinched, he had not judged. He had simply offered a piece of hard, Western truth. They sat by the fire, the storm howling its grief around them. Later, as the logs burned down to embers, he looked at her hands, which she clutched in her lap. They were red, chapped, the knuckles swollen, the blisters on her palms weeping. He reached out, his own calloused, scarred hand looking enormous next to hers. He did not ask. He simply took her right hand in his. His skin was rough, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. He held her hand, turning it over, examining the damage she had done to herself in his service. He said nothing. He just held her hand, his thumb rubbing slowly over her bruised knuckles, warming the frozen skin. It was the first time he had touched her with anything that was not necessary. It was a gesture of such profound, unexpected tenderness that Eliza had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. He held her hand, and she held his, and they watched the fire die together. The cold in her room was no longer bearable. The storm had found its way through a crack in the chinking, and a fine powder of snow dusted the floor by her bed. She lay shivering, her body rigid. The memory of Silas's touch on her hand a single, warm point in a universe of ice. It was past 2 a.m. The house was silent save for the wind. She could not stay there. She would freeze. She did not think. It was not a decision, but an instinct. She rose from her bed, her bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards. She grabbed her pillow and her quilt and walked down the dark hallway to the last door. His room. She opened the latch. It clicked loudly in the quiet. She slipped inside. His room was warmer. The stove in the corner was banked, radiating a dull, steady heat. She could just make out his shape in the large bed, a mound of blankets. Silas was awake. He had been awake since he heard her door open. He lay perfectly still, his body tense, his hand moving slowly toward the pistol he kept on the nightstand. "Mrs. Granger?" he whispered into the dark. "I am so cold," she whispered back. Her voice was a small, desperate thing. "I cannot stay in my room. It is freezing." He did not move for a long time. He could send her back. He could tell her to build up her fire, but he knew the cold she was talking about. It was a cold that got into your bones. He shifted, his voice thick with sleep and tension. "There is room." Eliza moved across the floor and, trembling, climbed into the bed. She lay on the very edge of the mattress, her back to him, clutching her pillow. The sheets were warm from his body. She was acutely aware of him, of the size of him, of the heat radiating from him just inches away. She could smell the faint scents of tobacco, whiskey, and soap. Silas lay rigid on his side, facing her back. He was terrified. It had been 5 years since a woman had been in his bed. 5 years since he had felt this kind of warmth. He did not know what to do. He stared at the pale shape of her shoulders under the quilt, listening to her shiver. Neither of them slept. They lay like two statues, separated by a chasm of grief, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the shutters. Eliza slipped out of the bed before he was stirring and fled back to her own room. The next night, the storm had not broken. The cold was just as deep. Eliza stood at her door, hesitating. She could not go back. It was improper. It was too much to ask. In his room, Silas lay awake, listening. He heard her door creak. He heard her hesitate in the hall. He waited. She came in, just as quietly as the night before. This time, when she slipped under the covers, she did not feel as cold. He had left more space for her. They lay in the dark, the silence stretching. He broke it. He rolled onto his side, his body brushing hers. Eliza flinched, her entire body going rigid. He reached out a hand and laid it on her shoulder. She was trembling. He said nothing. He just turned her slowly, gently, to face him. In the gloom, she could see the dark shape of his face, the intensity of his unseen eyes. He lowered his head. Their first kiss was not a kiss of passion. It was a slow, uncertain collision in the dark. I was hesitant. His lips were chapped, his beard rough against her skin. It tasted of loneliness and 5 years of winter. She was stiff in his arms, her own lips cold and unmoving, but she did not pull away. He kissed her again, deeper this time, a question, and this time, she answered. A small, broken sound escaped her throat, and she kissed him back. It was a kiss of grief. All the sorrow she had for Samuel, all the shame she carried, all the cold she had endured, it poured out of her, and for him, it was the breaking of a dam. The long, frozen wall of his self-control shattered. He pulled her against him, his arms crushing her, his mouth finding hers with a sudden, desperate hunger. This was not the gentleman who had warmed her hands. This was a man starved of touch, of life, of another human soul. Their lovemaking was raw and hesitant. It was clumsy. He was rough, not with intent, but with disuse. His large body trembling with a need so profound it frightened them both. She was terrified, her hands pushing against his chest even as her body arched toward his. It was painful and desperate and deeply, overwhelmingly emotional. It was two broken souls clinging to each other in a blizzard, trying to find a spark of life in the frozen dark. When it was over, they lay tangled in the sheets, slick with sweat, the wind howling outside, and Eliza began to weep. She wept for the child she had lost, for the preacher's son who had abandoned her, for the cold boat ride west, for the sheer, unadulterated relief of being held. Silas held her, his own breath ragged. He stroked her hair, his hand shaking. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just held her as she cried, and in the darkness, where she could not see, his own face was wet. He wept silently, for Mary, for his son, and for the first crack of light he felt in his own buried heart. The next morning, the storm had broken. A brilliant, painful sun glared off a world that was buried in 6 feet of snow. The silence was back, but it was a new kind. It was brittle, awkward, and charged. Eliza rose from his bed in the gray dawn, her body aching. She dressed quickly and fled downstairs to the kitchen, her face burning. When Silas came down, he was wearing his ranch clothes, his face scrubbed clean, his hair damp. He did not look at her. He poured a cup of coffee. "Need to dig out the barn," he said, his voice gravelly. "See the stock?" Eliza nodded, her eyes on the skillet she was scrubbing. "I will make breakfast." They did not speak of the night. They did not acknowledge the kiss, or the tears, or the moment they had broken apart in each other's arms. It was too new, too fragile. To speak of it would be to shatter it. But when they went outside to begin the back-breaking work of digging out, they moved together. He shoveled the heavy snow from the main path, and she followed with a broom, clearing the steps. They worked side by side, a silent team. He would pause to watch her, to make sure she was not overexerting herself. She would pause to watch him, marveling at the sheer strength he possessed. They were closer than they had ever been. and more cautious. A week passed. The world began to thaw. Jeb and the men emerged from the bunkhouse, gaunt but alive. The rhythm of the ranch resumed. One afternoon, Jeb rode in from a trip to Laramie, which had finally been cleared. He carried a leather mail sack. "Mrs. Granger," he said, handing her a small bundle of letters and catalogs, his use of her name now natural and respectful. Eliza sorted through them. Bills for Silas, a catalog for seeds, and at the bottom, a thin envelope of cheap paper. Her blood turned to ice. The postmark was from Boston. The handwriting was sharp and accusatory, a hand she knew too well. She looked up, her heart hammering. Silas was walking from the barn, his eyes on her. He saw her face. He saw the way she clutched the envelope. "What is it?" he asked, his voice neutral. "Nothing," Eliza said, too quickly. "Just a letter from an old acquaintance." She slipped the letter into the pocket of her apron, her hand trembling. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable, and the fragile, unspoken trust that had been built in the darkness of the storm suddenly felt as thin as ice on a spring pond. Her past had found her. Spring broke over the Wyoming territory not with a whisper, but with a violent, muddy exhaling of the earth. The snow, which had entombed the ranch for 5 long months, receded into the high peaks, leaving behind a world that was sodden, raw, and bursting with frantic life. The creeks swelled to roiling brown torrents that tore at their banks, and the air lost its bite, replaced by the sweet, heavy scent of wet sagebrush and warming pine resin. For Eliza, the thaw felt like a loosening of the iron bands that had constricted her chest since her arrival. She opened the windows of the main house, letting the breeze scour away the stagnant smell of wood smoke and winter confinement. She scrubbed the floors with a vigor that matched the new energy of the season, her movements lighter, her eyes brighter. The ranch came alive. The silence of winter was replaced by the bawling of calves, the shouts of men, and the rhythmic thud of hooves in the mud. It was branding season, a time of brutal hard work that required every hand, including hers. Eliza took charge of the chuck wagon with a competence that surprised even Jeb. She was up well before dawn, baking biscuits by the 100 in the Dutch ovens, frying slabs of bacon, and boiling coffee that was thick and black enough to float a horseshoe. She brought the noon meal out to the holding pens, driving the buckboard wagon herself, the reins confident in her gloved hands. It was during one of these noon breaks that the change between her and Silas became undeniable to the rest of the world. The men were exhausted, covered in dust and the smell of singed hair. They sat on the tailgate of the wagon and on the ground, plates balanced on their knees. A young greenhorn hand named Tobias, who had been hired on from Laramie just a week prior, was trying to impress the older hands with his roping skills while eating a biscuit. Tobias stood up to demonstrate a throw, tangled his spur in a coil of rope, and went down in a spectacular heap, upending a bucket of water directly onto Jeb. The foreman sat frozen, water dripping from his mustache, a piece of bacon suspended halfway to his mouth. The silence that followed was absolute, filled only by the terrified, wide eyes of Tobias. Then, a sound cut through the air. It was a low, rusty rumble that grew into a bark. Silas Granger was laughing. He stood by the wheel of the wagon, his head thrown back, his chest heaving with genuine mirth. It was a sound so foreign, so unexpected, that the ranch hands stared at him as if he had suddenly spoken in Greek. Eliza, standing on the wagon bed serving beans, felt a bubble of joy rise in her own throat. She looked at Silas, seeing the way the sun caught the silver in his beard, the way the lines of grief around his eyes crinkled into something softer. She started to laugh too, a clear, bell-like sound that joined him. Soon, the whole camp was roaring. Jeb wiped his face, chuckling darkly, and even Tobias managed a sheepish grin. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of the territory, but it marked a shifting of the earth as profound as the spring thaw. The ghost of the grieving widower was fading, replaced by a man who was remembering how to live. A week later, on a Sunday when the work had slowed, Silas appeared at the back door while Eliza was drying the breakfast dishes. He was holding a bridle in his hands. "Leave the dishes," he said. "The day's too fine to be inside." Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, her heart giving a traitorous little skip. "Where are we going?" "To see the future," Silas said cryptically. He had saddled a sturdy roan mare for her, a horse with a gentle eye and a smooth gait. Eliza had never ridden before coming west, but over the winter, Silas had taught her the basics in the corral. This was to be her first true ride into the open country. They rode south, away from the ranch house and the cattle herds, heading toward a ridge of timber that bordered the property. Silas rode a massive black gelding, sitting in the saddle with the easy grace of a man who spent more time on a horse than on his feet. He kept his pace slow, matching hers, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead for badger holes or rattlesnakes. The land was a tapestry of color. The slopes were blanketed in the fiery red of Indian paintbrush and the delicate blue of larkspur. The sky was a dome of impossible azure, stretching over them with a benevolence that made the blizzards of February seem like a bad dream. They crested the ridge and looked down into a sheltered valley that Eliza had never seen. It was a bowl of green grass, protected on three sides by rock walls, with a glittering creek winding through the center like a silver ribbon. It was peaceful, secluded, and breathtakingly beautiful. Silas pulled his horse to a stop and rested his hands on the saddle horn. He looked out over the valley with a quiet possessiveness. "I bought this parcel 3 years ago," he said. "It has the best water on the range. The grass stays green here even in August. It is lovely." "Silas," Eliza said, breathless, "it looks like a painting." He pointed to a flat rise of land near the creek, where a grove of cottonwood trees offered shade. "That is where I want to build it," he said. "Build what? Another barn?" "No." Silas shook his head. "A school." Eliza looked at him, stunned. "A school? But the town is 10 miles away." "The town is too far for the children of the ranchers and the homesteaders out this way," Silas said, his voice serious. "I have watched them, good families. They work themselves into the ground, and their children grow up knowing nothing but the plow and the saddle. They cannot read. They cannot write their own names. That is a kind of prison. Eliza, I want to give them a key." He looked at her then, his gray eyes intense. "My son, Silas Jr. We had just started teaching him his letters when he died. He was smart. He had a mind like a trap. I want to build a place where other sons and daughters can learn, a proper schoolhouse. I will pay for the teacher myself if I have to." Eliza felt a swell of emotion so strong it pressed against the back of her throat. She looked at this man, this rough, scarred, formidable man, and saw the depth of his heart. He was not just surviving. He was trying to build a world that was better than the one that had broken him. "It is a wonderful dream. Silas," she whispered. He guided his horse closer to hers until their knees brushed. "It is not a dream, Eliza. It is a plan, and I will need help. I know cattle. I know grass. I do not know books. I can help," she said immediately. "I can read. I can write. I was well taught." Silas nodded, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "I know. I have seen you reading the Bible in the evenings. You have a teacher's voice." They sat there for a long time, watching the hawks circle over the valley. Two people plotting a future in a land that usually only promised survival. The deepening bond between them did not go unnoticed by the world outside the ranch. When they rode into town for supplies, heads turned. They were no longer the tragic widower and the beggar bride. They were a couple. Silas walked with his head high, his hand often hovering near the small of her back, a protective, claiming gesture. Eliza walked with a new dignity, her chin lifted, her step sure. The townsfolk of Laramie were a mixed lot. The shopkeepers and the men who did business with Silas began to treat Eliza with deferential respect. They saw that she had survived the winter, that she had put meat on her bones, and that she had somehow tamed the wildest thing in the territory, Silas Granger's grief. But acceptance was not universal. There was a faction of women in the town, led by the formidable Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. who viewed Eliza with deep suspicion. To them, a woman who appeared from nowhere, with no family and no history, was a threat to the moral fabric of their community. They whispered in the pews at church. They tightened their shawls when Eliza passed on the boardwalk. The rumors were vicious. Some said she was a divorced woman from Chicago. Others whispered that she was a whore from the tenements of New York, fleeing the law or a pimp. They dissected her appearance, her silence, and the way she looked at men, searching for the looseness they were sure existed. Silas was aware of the whispers, but he chose to ignore them, until the day he couldn't. It was late May. Silas had driven the wagon into town to pick up a shipment of barbed wire and flour. He had left Eliza at the general store with a list of dry goods while he went to the freight office. Eliza stood at the counter, waiting for the clerk to weigh out a sack of sugar. She was feeling lighter than usual. Earlier that morning, Silas had presented her with 3 brown paper parcels. Inside, she had found new clothes. They were not the silk finery of a city lady, but they were the best things she had ever owned. There was a dress of sturdy blue calico with white buttons, a heavy wool riding skirt, and a pair of boots that actually fit her feet. She had stared at the clothes, tears pricking her eyes. "Silas, you spent too much. I do not need these." "I ain't trying to dress you up like a doll," Silas had said, looking uncomfortable as he shoved his hands in his pockets. "I just want you warm. And I want you to have something that wasn't worn by a dead woman. Now." Wearing the blue calico, Eliza felt almost pretty. She hummed a soft tune as she examined a display of ribbons. The bell over the door jingled, and Mrs. Gable entered, accompanied by 2 of her acolytes. The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. They stopped when they saw Eliza. "Well, Mrs. Gable said loudly, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It seems the general store is letting just anyone in these days. I suppose standards have fallen since the winter." Eliza stiffened but did not turn. She focused on the ribbons, her fingers tightening on the spool. One of the other women giggled. "Money can buy new clothes, Martha, but it cannot buy a new nature. You can put a silk saddle on a sow, but it is still a sow." The clerk, a young man named Timothy, looked nervous. "Ladies, please, Mrs. Granger is a customer. Mrs. Granger, Mrs." Gable scoffed. "A title she wears as loosely as her morals. Tell me, Timothy, do you check the money she gives you? I hear money earned in the gutters of Boston carries a certain stench." Eliza spun around, her face flaming. "Mrs." Gable stood there, an armored ship of black bombazine and self-righteousness. "I have done nothing to you," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "I am a wife and a hard worker. You have no right to speak of me this way. Mrs." Gable stepped forward, her eyes cold and hard. "I have every right. We are decent people here. We know what you are. We can smell it." She spat. It was a deliberate, vicious act. The glob of spittle landed on the floor, inches from the toe of Eliza's new boot. The store went deathly silent. Timothy dropped the scoop into the sugar barrel. Eliza stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. She felt dirty, exposed, the shame of her past rising up to choke her. The door opened behind them. The little bell gave a cheerful, incongruous ring. Silas Granger stepped inside. He did not need to be told what had happened. He saw Eliza's pale face. He saw the spittle on the floor. He saw the smirk that was just fading from Mrs. Gable's lips. Silas closed the door gently. He walked forward, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. He did not look at Eliza. He looked straight at the banker's wife. Silas was a large man, but at that moment, he seemed to fill the entire room. His anger was not a hot, shouting thing. It was a cold, suffocating pressure. "Pick it up," Silas said. "Mrs." Gable blinked, her smirk faltering. "I beg your pardon? You heard me," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "You spat on the floor near my wife. You will clean it up. Mrs." Gable drew herself up, her indignation flaring. "I will do no such thing. Silas Granger, you forget yourself." "My husband owns the bank that holds the note in half this town. I own my land," Silas said, and I own my debts. Your husband is a bookkeeper. I am the man who dragged this country out of the wilderness while he was still polishing his spectacles back east. Now, clean it up." He took a step closer. He did not raise a hand, but the threat of violence radiated from him like heat from a furnace. The other two women backed away, terrified. "Mrs." Gable looked at Silas's eyes and saw something that made her blood run cold. She saw a man who had buried a wife and child and had nothing left to lose but the woman standing behind him, trembling with rage and humiliation. "Mrs." Gable reached into her reticule, pulled out a lace handkerchief, and bent down. She wiped the floorboards. "Now apologize," Silas said. "Mrs." Gable stood up, her face a mask of hate. "I apologize. I am sorry," she choked out, not looking at Eliza. Silas stared at her for a long moment, then turned his back on her. He offered his arm to Eliza. "Come, Eliza. We are done here." Eliza took his arm. Her legs were trembling so badly she could barely walk. They exited the store into the bright sunshine, leaving the town gossip in a heap of shattered pride and silence. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Silas drove the horses with a grim intensity, his jaw set. Eliza sat beside him, clutching her hands in her lap. The victory in the store did not feel like a victory to her. It felt like a stay of execution. They had defended her. Yes, but the words "Mrs." Gable had spoken. The accusations of filth, of gutter money, echoed in her ears. They were closer to the truth than Silas knew. She felt like a fraud. She felt like she was soiling him by simply existing in his space. That night, the house was quiet. They went to bed early, exhausted by the emotion of the day. Since the blizzard, Eliza had slept in Silas's bed every night. It had become their sanctuary. They would lie together, sometimes talking, sometimes making love with a growing passion and familiarity, sometimes just holding each other. But tonight, Eliza lay on the very edge of the mattress, her back to him. She felt cold, despite the warmth of the room. She felt the invisible barrier of her secrets rising up between them again. Silas shifted. He reached out and placed a hand on her hip. Eliza flinched. She tried to scoot further away, nearly falling off the bed. Silas's grip tightened. He did not let her go. He pulled her back toward him, his strength effortless. "Eliza, stop," he rumbled. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You should not touch me." "Why?" Silas asked. "Because of what that old bat said? She is a bitter woman with a heart like a dried prune." "Because she is right," Eliza cried out, turning to face him in the dark. Silas went still. "What are you talking about?" Eliza sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest. The moonlight coming through the window washed her face in silver, showing the track of tears on her cheeks. "I am not who you think I am." "Silas, I told you I had sins, but I did not tell you what they were. You stood up for me today. You claimed me. But if you knew the truth, you would have let her spit on me." Silas sat up slowly. He leaned back against the headboard, his face in shadow. "Tell me, then." Eliza took a ragged breath. It felt like she was standing on a gallows trap door. "I was not just a worker in Boston," she began, her voice trembling. "My father was a preacher, a fire and brimstone man. We lived in the parsonage. I was raised to be pure, to be good." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "When I was 18, the bishop sent his son to stay with us. His name was Thomas. He was handsome, and he quoted poetry, and he told me he loved me. He told me that God made love, so how could it be a sin if we loved each other?" She let out a bitter, broken laugh. "I was a fool. I believed him. I gave him everything. And when I told him I was with child, he laughed. He said he was engaged to a banker's daughter in Philadelphia. He said I was just a country mouse who opened her legs too easily." Silas made a sound, a low growl in his throat. But he did not speak. "My father found out," Eliza continued, the words rushing out now. "He did not blame Thomas. He blamed me. He said I was a temptress. Jezebel. He threw me out on the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. I went to the workhouse. I scrubbed the floors until my hands bled. I had the baby," she whispered. "A boy." Samuel, he was beautiful. Silas, he had my eyes, but the fever came. The workhouse was cold, and I could not afford a doctor. I held him while he burned up. I prayed to God to take me instead. But God does not listen to women like me. Samuel died, and they buried him in a pine box with no name. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. I am a fallen woman. Silas, I am an unwed mother whose child died of neglect. That is what I am. And you are a good man. You deserve better than a woman who is stained. She waited. She waited for the anger. She waited for him to tell her to get out, to go back to the rags and the cold. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then the bed springs creaked. Silas moved. He did not pull away. He moved closer. He reached out and took her face in his large, rough hands. He forced her to look at him. His eyes were not hard. They were fierce, burning with an intensity that scorched her skin. "You listen to me, Eliza Granger," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are not stained. You were a child who was used by a wolf in sheep's clothing. That is not your sin. That is his. And the only shame in that story belongs to the father who threw his own blood into the street." "But I—" "Hush," Silas commanded. "You fought. You survived. You loved your son until the moment he left this world. That is not a weakness. That is the strongest thing I have ever heard." He ran his thumb over her cheek, wiping away a fresh tear. "I told you once that we all have sins. My sin was despair. My sin was letting my grief turn me into stone while the world kept turning. You brought me back to life, Eliza. You. Not a saint, not a perfect woman. You." He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. She could hear his heart beating, steady and strong beneath his ribs. "You belong right here." He whispered into her hair. "I do not care what happened in Boston. I do not care about preachers or bishops or the lies they tell. You are my wife. You are the woman who dug this ranch out of the snow. You are the woman who is helping me build a school." He pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. "You are the only thing in this world that matters to me." Eliza looked at him, her breath catching in a sob. She saw the truth in his face. He knew her darkest secret, and he was still looking at her with a hunger and a reverence that shook her to her core. She realized then, with a terrifying clarity, that she was falling in love with him. Not just gratitude, not just safety, but a deep, abiding love for this man who had seen her scars and called them beautiful. But with the realization came a new, sharper fear. She was happy. For the first time in years, she was happy. And in her life, happiness had always been the harbinger of disaster. She clung to him, burying her face in his neck, weeping with relief and terror. "I love you," she thought. But she did not say it. She was too afraid that if she spoke the words, the universe would hear and take him away, just like it had taken Samuel. Silas held her until her weeping subsided, stroking her back with his calloused hand. He did not know her internal terror. He only knew that she was here, warm and alive in his arms, and that he would burn down the entire town of Laramie before he let anyone hurt her again. The arrival of the stranger in Laramie was like a drop of ink falling into a glass of clear water. It was early June, and the high plains were awash in the vibrant green of early summer. The air smelled of heating dust and blooming clover, a deceptive peace that masked the arrival of the past. He stepped off the midday stagecoach, a man who looked entirely out of place against the rough-hewn timber of the frontier town. He wore a suit of dark, worsted wool that was far too heavy for the season, a stiff collar that choked his neck, and small, round spectacles that caught the glare of the relentless Wyoming sun. His name was Arthur Thorne, and he carried the stench of the city with him. Thorne did not go to the hotel. He went straight to the sheriff's office, and then to the general store, asking questions with a soft, insipid voice that made the locals bristle. He was looking for a woman. He said, a woman named Eliza, a woman who had fled justice. News traveled faster than lightning on the open range. By the time Silas rode into town that afternoon to collect a new plowshare from the blacksmith, the whispers were already swirling like dust devils. Silas tied his horse, a massive bay gelding, to the rail outside the smithy. He felt the eyes on him. It was a familiar sensation, but the tenor was different today. It was not the respect he had earned, nor the fear he commanded. It was pity mixed with a dark curiosity. Jeb, who had ridden in with him, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Something is wrong. Boss, the air feels tight." Silas ignored him and walked into the blacksmith's shop. But before he could ask for his order, a shadow fell across the doorway. Arthur Thorne stood there, clutching a leather satchel, flanked by the town sheriff, a man named Miller who owed Silas his position and knew it. "Mr. Granger?" Thorne asked, stepping into the dim, smoky interior of the shop. Silas turned slowly. He wiped his hands on a rag, his face impassive. "Who is asking?" "My name is Arthur Thorne. I represent the parish of St. Jude in Boston. I am here regarding the woman you call your wife." Silas went very still. The clang of the hammer in the back of the shop seemed to fade away. "What about her?" Thorne adjusted his spectacles, looking smug. "It has come to our attention that she is residing here. We have a warrant for her arrest. She is wanted for the theft of $300 from the church orphan fund. She stole the money and fled the city." Sheriff Miller looked at his boots, uncomfortable. "Now, Silas, let us not get hasty. This gentleman says he has papers." Silas dropped the rag. He took 2 steps forward, towering over the smaller man. "Eliza stole nothing." Thorne smiled, a thin, oily expression. "Ah, so she has beguiled you as well. She is a master of deception. Mr. Granger, a fallen woman who compounds her sins with thievery. The money went missing the very night she disappeared. It is a clear case. I am here to take her back to answer for her crimes." Silas laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a terrifying, dry sound. "You come onto my land, or near my wife, and you will not need a warrant. You will need a doctor." Thorne took a step back, his confidence faltering in the face of Silas's physical menace. "The law is the law, sir. You cannot harbor a criminal." "Get out of my sight," Silas said, his voice dropping to a growl. "Before I forget that I am a civilized man." He brushed past them, shouldering Thorne into the doorframe, and marched out into the sunlight. He rode back to the ranch in a fury, his mind rejecting the accusation. Eliza, who cried over a dead bird. Eliza, who worked until her hands bled. She was no thief, but when he arrived at the ranch, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the yard. The house was quiet, too quiet. He walked into the kitchen. The fire in the stove was dead. A half-peeled potato sat on the counter, the knife abandoned beside it. "Eliza?" he called out. There was no answer. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He threw open the door to their bedroom. The bed was made, the quilt smoothed with precision. On his pillow lay a piece of paper, torn from the ledger she used to teach the children. Silas picked it up. His hands, which could wrestle a steer to the ground, shook violently. "I am sorry. I cannot let my shadow darken your name. He will destroy you to get to me. You deserve better." The paper crumpled in his fist. She was gone. The storm hit an hour after sunset. It was a summer violence, a collision of heat and cold air coming off the peaks that turned the sky a chaotic purple. Thunder rolled down the valley like artillery fire, and the rain came in blinding, horizontal sheets that turned the hard-packed earth into a slick, treacherous mire. Silas did not care. He was on his horse, a lantern swinging wildly from his saddle horn, riding south. He knew where she would go. She would not head for town. She would fear the stagecoach now. She would try to reach the railhead at Cheyenne, cutting through the high passes, and to do that, she had to cross the Blackwood Ridge. The wind tore at his slicker, whipping the heavy canvas against his legs. The rain was cold, driving the heat of the day into the mud. Lightning flashed, illuminating the world in stark, terrifying bursts of white light. Silas leaned forward, urging the horse on. He was not tracking signs. The rain had washed those away. He was tracking his own fear. He knew the terrain. There was an old shepherd's cabin near the crest of the ridge, a tumble-down shack used by sheep herders in the summer. It was the only shelter for 10 miles. If she was out in this without cover, she would die. The temperature was dropping fast, and the rain was turning to hail. "Eliza!" he screamed into the wind. The thunder swallowed his voice. He pushed the horse up the steep, rocky trail. The animal stumbled, its hooves slipping on the wet slate. But Silas held it together with a will of iron. He would not lose her. He had lost Mary to the snow. He had lost his son to the fever. He would not lose Eliza to a lie from Boston. He saw the cabin through a break in the rain. It was a dark, hunched shape against the lightning-lit sky. The door was banging in the wind, hanging on one hinge. Silas swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He abandoned the animal and ran through the mud, bursting into the cabin. Eliza was there. She was huddled in the corner, wet to the bone. Her dress was soaked, plastering to her shivering frame. She had tried to start a fire in the ruined hearth, but the wood was damp and only smoked. She looked up as he filled the doorway, her eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. She scrambled to her feet, backing away until she hit the rough log wall. "Go back!" she screamed, her voice thin and hysterical. "You have to go back!" Silas kicked the door shut against the wind and crossed the small room in 2 strides. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip bruising. "What are you doing?" he roared, the anger pouring out of him mixed with relief. "You run from me? In this? I have to go," Eliza cried, fighting against his grip, beating her small fists against his wet chest. "He is here! Silas! Thorne! He will take everything from you! He will drag you into the mud with me! I stole the money! Let me go! I am going to Denver! You are going nowhere!" Silas shouted back. He shook her, trying to snap her out of the panic. "You think I care about money? You think I care about what some city lawyer thinks? I am a thief," she sobbed, collapsing against him as her legs gave out. "I am a criminal. You deserve a wife who is clean. You deserve better." Silas held her up, his face inches from hers. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat onto her cheeks, mixing with her tears. "You think I am scared of your past?" he yelled, his voice cracking with the raw force of his emotion. "You think I am scared of a little scandal? I lived through hell. Eliza, I buried my whole life. I am not scared of what you did." He pulled her face up, forcing her to look at him. "I am scared of losing you." The confession hung in the damp, freezing air of the cabin. The thunder rumbled overhead. Softer now. Eliza went still. She stared at him, seeing the naked terror in his eyes. This man, who fought wolves and blizzards and men twice his size, was trembling because he thought he had lost her. "I thought," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I thought you would hate me." Silas let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her wet body, burying his face in her sodden hair. "Hate you?" he breathed. "I would burn the world down before I let you go." They stood there for a long time, clinging to each other in the dark, leaking cabin, while the storm raged itself out against the mountains. The ride back to the ranch was slow and brutal. The rain had not stopped, but the violence had gone out of it. Silas lifted Eliza onto his saddle, climbing up behind her. He wrapped his heavy slicker around her, buttoning it to her chin, enclosing her in his warmth. He did not speak. He simply held her, one arm around her waist, the other holding the reins. He could feel her shivering subside as her body drew heat from his. When they reached the ranch house, the windows were dark. The world felt empty, as if they were the only 2 people left in existence. Silas carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them. He did not ask her to do anything. He sat her by the hearth and built the fire up until it roared. He stripped the wet clothes from her body with efficient, shaking hands, wrapping her in dry blankets. He poured a glass of whiskey and held it to her lips. "Drink," he ordered softly. She drank, the liquid fire burning her throat. The color began to return to her cheeks. Silas paced the room. He was still running on adrenaline. He looked at her, huddled in the chair, her hair drying in wild tendrils around her face. "Why did you run?" he asked again, his voice quieter now, but still edged with pain. "Why did you not trust me?" "Because I'm guilty." "Silas," she said, looking into the fire. "Tell me," he said. Eliza took a deep breath. She told him everything. "It was Thorne," she said, her voice hollow. "He was the assistant to the rector. He handled the accounts. He had eyes for me. He would corner me in the vestry. He told me that if I was nice to him, he could help me. He knew about Samuel. He knew about my father. He said a woman like me needed a protector." She shuddered. "One night, he tried to force me. I fought him. I hit him with a candlestick and ran. The next morning, the orphan fund was gone. $300. He took it, Silas, and he told the police that I did it. He told them I seduced him, stole the keys, and took the money. Who would they believe? The pious churchman or the fallen woman?" Silas stopped pacing. He stood by the fire, his silhouette dark and imposing. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "So he stole from orphans and blamed you," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "And now he comes here to drag you back to prison to cover his tracks." "Yes," Eliza whispered. "If I go back, I go to jail. Or worse." Silas turned to look at her. The firelight caught the hard lines of his face. He looked like a judgment from the Old Testament. "He will not take you back," Silas said. "He has the law." "Silas, I do not care about the law," Silas said. "I will kill him." Eliza gasped. She threw off the blanket and ran to him, grabbing his arm. "No, Silas, no!" He looked down at her, his eyes cold. "He tried to hurt you. He ruined your life. He deserves to die. If you kill him, you become a murderer," Eliza pleaded, shaking him. "You will hang, and then I will truly be alone. Please, Silas, no more death. I cannot bear more death." Silas looked at her desperate face. He saw the fear there, not for herself, but for him. She was trying to save his soul, just as he had saved her life. He took a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders slowly uncoiling. He covered her hand with his. "I will not kill him," he said, the words tasting like ash. "But I will not let him touch you. Promise me," she begged. "I promise," he said, "but we handle this my way. No more running. You stay here. You stay with me. I will stay," she said. "I will never run again." The promise hung between them, heavy and binding. The fear of the last few hours, the frantic search, the near loss, it all suddenly collapsed into a different kind of need. Silas looked at her, standing there in nothing but his shirt and the firelight. He reached out and pulled her to him. This time, there was no hesitation. He kissed her, and it was a kiss of possession. It was a claim. He swept her up into his arms and carried her up the stairs to their bed. That night, they made love with a desperation that bordered on violence. It was not the gentle, hesitant union of the blizzard. It was a storm of its own. They moved together with a frantic rhythm, trying to erase the distance, trying to merge their bodies so completely that nothing, not the law, not the past, not God himself, could tear them apart. Eliza cried out his name, arching against him, her nails digging into his shoulders. Silas held her as if she were the only solid thing in a disintegrating world. When the end came, it left them both shattered and breathless, tangled in the sheets, their hearts beating in a synchronized, thunderous rhythm. They fell asleep instantly, exhausted, his arm thrown heavy and protective over her waist. The next morning broke with a clarity that only followed a great storm. The sky was a washed-out, innocent blue. The mud in the yard was drying under the relentless sun. Silas woke first. He lay for a moment, listening to Eliza's steady breathing beside him. He felt a fierce, terrifying protectiveness swell in his chest. He would handle Thorne. He did not know how yet. Perhaps he would bribe him. Perhaps he would terrify him into confession. But he would handle it. He nudged Eliza awake. "Get dressed," he said softly. She blinked, confused. "Is he here?" "No," Silas said. "But we are going for a ride." He took her in the buckboard wagon this time. They drove south, past the grazing herds, the cattle looking clean and sleek after the rain. They did not speak much, but Silas kept his hand on her knee the entire way. They crested the ridge overlooking the valley where the school was to be. Eliza gasped. Down in the valley, in the grove of cottonwoods near the creek, the skeleton of a building had risen. It was not just a schoolhouse. It was a home. Over the last month, while Eliza had been teaching the children in the church basement or managing the house, Silas had been coming here in secret. He and Jeb had raised the frame. It was small but sturdy, built of peeled pine logs that gleamed gold in the sunlight. Silas stopped the wagon. "I told you I wanted to build a school," he said, looking down at the structure. "And I will. The classroom will be on the south side, but the rest is a house." He turned to her. "I started building it the day after you told me about your son," he said. I thought maybe the big house has too many ghosts. I thought maybe we needed a place that was just ours. A place that didn't know about Mary or the fever or Boston." Eliza stared at the wooden ribs of the house rising from the green grass. It was a promise written in timber. It was the future. "For me?" she whispered. "For us," Silas corrected. He pointed to the space in front of the frame. "There is good soil there," he said, facing south. "It would take a garden well. Flowers, vegetables, whatever you want." Eliza looked at the frame, and then at the man sitting beside her, the man who had dragged her back from the edge of the world. She took his hand and pressed it to her cheek. "It is perfect," she said. Silas nodded, his face serious. "It is a start. Now, we go back to town. We find this thorn, and we bury the past so we can live in that house." He turned the wagon around. But as they headed back toward the ranch, a column of black smoke rose into the sky from the direction of Laramie. It was a thick, oily pillar that stained the perfect blue sky. Silas frowned, snapping the reins. The horses broke into a trot. The peace of the morning had been a lie. The storm was over, but the fire was just beginning. The ride back from the valley was heavy with a new, shared resolve. The frame of the house stood behind them, a silent promise, while the town of Laramie lay ahead, a place of judgment and impending conflict. Silas did not ride to the ranch. He turned the wagon east, toward the town proper, his knuckles white on the reins, his jaw set in a line of unyielding granite. Eliza sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly her fingers ached. She did not ask where they were going. She knew. The terror of the previous night had been burned away, leaving a cold, hard courage she had not known she possessed. She had run from her past for the last time. Now, beside this man, she would face it. When they reached Laramie, the mid-morning sun was beating down, turning the dusty main street into a pale, glaring strip. The town was quiet, the weekday lull settling between the morning chores and the noon meal. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop directly in front of the town's only hotel, a 2-story clapboard building with a sagging porch. "Stay here," Silas said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were not. He swung down from the wagon, his boots thudding on the packed earth. He did not bother with the hotel's main entrance. He walked straight into the saloon attached to it, the bat-wing doors swinging wildly in his wake. Eliza watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear the murmur of voices from inside, the clink of glasses. Then, silence. A moment later, the saloon doors burst open again. Arthur Thorne stumbled out onto the boardwalk, propelled from behind by Silas's unyielding grip on his coat collar. Thorne's hat was gone. His spectacles were askew, and a dark stain of whiskey was splashed across his pristine white shirt. "You cannot do this!" Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking with fear and indignation. "I am an officer of the church. I have papers. Sheriff—" Silas did not strike him. He simply hauled him down the steps and into the middle of the street, as a man might haul a sack of rotten feed. The commotion drew immediate attention. Doors opened. Faces appeared in the windows. Sheriff Miller came running from his office, his hand on his holstered pistol. "Silas!" Miller yelled, breathless. "What in God's name are you doing? Let the man go!" "He is not a man," Silas said, his voice carrying across the street. clear and cold as a mountain spring. He is a liar and a thief. He released Thorn, shoving him so hard the smaller man fell to his knees in the dust. "We are going to settle this," Silas declared, his voice ringing with an authority that stopped every person in their tracks. "We are going to settle this now, in the open, where God and everyone else can see." He strode past the gasping Thorn to the small white church at the end of the street. He grabbed the thick rope that hung by the door and pulled. The church bell began to toll. It was not the gentle summons of a Sunday morning, nor the slow, mournful peal for a funeral. It was a frantic, demanding clang, an alarm that spoke of fire or flood or Indian attack. It was a sound that could not be ignored. Within 10 minutes, the street was full. Ranch hands left the saloon. Shopkeepers locked their doors. Women in aprons and men in shirt sleeves hurried toward the church, their faces etched with alarm. Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, emerged from the mercantile, her expression one of profound disapproval at the disturbance. Silas Granger stood on the church steps, a silent, imposing figure, until the street was a crowded sea of familiar, anxious faces. Eliza had stepped down from the wagon, her legs trembling, and stood at the edge of the crowd, her new blue calico dress a splash of color in the drab, dusty assembly. When the bell's echo finally died, Silas spoke. "You all know me," he began, his voice a low rumble that needed no amplification. "I have lived in this territory for 15 years. I buried my wife and son in this churchyard. You have bought my cattle, and you have drunk my whiskey. You know I am not a man for idle talk." He pointed a long, damning finger at Arthur Thorn, who was brushing the dust from his suit, attempting to regain some small measure of dignity. "This man came here yesterday. He calls himself Arthur Thorn. He told Sheriff Miller that my wife, Eliza, is a thief. He says she stole $300 from a church in Boston and that he has a warrant to take her back." A collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned to Eliza, who flinched but held her ground. Mrs. Gable looked momentarily vindicated, her lips pursing in a triumphant smirk. Silas let the murmuring swell for a moment before cutting through them. "He is a liar," Thorn sputtered, stepping forward. "I am not. I have papers. She is a known sinner, a woman of low morals who—" Silas took one step down, and Thorn recoiled as if struck. "You will not speak her name," Silas growled. "You will only answer." He turned back to the crowd. "This man is the one who stole the money. He is an assistant who controls the accounts. When his theft was about to be discovered, he blamed her. He blamed her because she was alone. He blamed her because she was poor. He blamed her because she was an easy target, a woman he had tried to exploit and failed. "It is her word against mine," Thorn cried, appealing to the sheriff. "And I am a man of God. She is a known prostitute." A low, ugly murmur started. The crowd was a fickle beast. They had feared Silas, but they loved a scandal. "She is a whore from the gutters," Thorn yelled, emboldened. "She seduced me, and when I spurned her, she stole from the orphans." "That is not true," Eliza's voice, clear and shaking, cut through the noise. She pushed her way through the onlookers to stand at the bottom of the steps, her head high. "I never touched him. He lied." "Lies!" Thorn shrieked, his face turning a blotchy red. "You will hang for this, you Jezebel." "He did not call you that," a new voice said. It was quiet, but it carried an authority that silenced the street. A woman stepped forward from the crowd. It was Miss Abigail Finch, the town's schoolteacher. She was a plain woman in her late 30s, dressed in a gray skirt and a white blouse, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was known for her quiet demeanor and her total lack of interest in gossip. She was, perhaps, the most respected and least heated woman in Laramie. "What did you say?" "Miss Finch," Sheriff Miller asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. Miss Finch walked slowly forward until she stood just a few feet from Arthur Thorn. She stared at him, her gaze analytical and cold. "I said," she repeated, "he did not call you that, because your name is not Arthur Thorn." Thorn's face went white. I do not know what you mean. My name is Abigail Finch, the schoolteacher said, as if addressing a class. For 5 years, I was the headmistress of the Lutheran Children's Home in Kansas City. Before that, I taught in Denver. I saw you there, in the autumn of 1878. You were an assistant to the bishop. You called yourself Mr. Stone. I have never been to Denver, Thorne hissed, his eyes darting toward the edge of the crowd, as if measuring the distance to his horse. You were dismissed, Miss Finch continued, her voice gaining strength. Relentless. You were dismissed after $2,000 went missing from the mission fund. They did not prosecute. The bishop was too ashamed of the scandal. But I saw your face every day for 6 months. I remember you. You prey on churches. Mr. Stone, or Mr. Thorne, or whatever name you choose to hide behind. The crowd erupted. The accusation from Silas was one thing. He was an interested party, but the word of Miss Finch was iron. Thorne turned to run. He did not get 2 steps. Silas's hand shot out and grabbed him by the shirt front, lifting him off his feet. You come here, Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. You come here and you ruin my wife's name. You accuse her of your own sickness. He dragged the struggling man back to the steps and threw him down at the feet of Sheriff Miller. Thorne, his face a mask of terror, began to blubber. It was a lie. All of it. I never stole anything. She is the liar. Silas looked at the sheriff. Well, Miller, you have a man identified as a known embezzler, a man using a false name, and you have my wife. Who are you going to believe? Sheriff Miller looked at Silas's face, at the cold eyes of Miss Finch, and at the muttering, angry crowd. He drew his pistol and pointed it at the whimpering man on the ground. Mr. Thorne, or whoever you are, he said gruffly, you are under arrest for fraud, and for vagrancy, and for disturbing the peace. As the sheriff hauled Thorne to his feet and dragged him toward the jail, the crowd's energy shifted. The anger at Thorne turned into a collective, uncomfortable shame. They had been so quick to believe the worst. Silas ignored them. He walked down the steps to where Eliza stood, shaking. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side. He turned and faced the town. He looked at Mrs. Gable, who was staring at the ground. He looked at the shopkeepers and the ranch hands. This is my wife, Silas said, his voice clear and final. Her name is Eliza Granger. She is the bravest woman I have ever known. She survived a past that would have broken any of us, and she is done surviving. From now on, she will live. He held her tighter, his gaze sweeping over them all, a king addressing his subjects. She is my wife. You want to judge her. You judge me. 2, you have a problem with her. You have a problem with me, and I promise you, that is a problem you do not want. He turned his back on them all and lifted Eliza into the wagon. He climbed up beside her and, without a backward glance, drove out of town, leaving the townsfolk standing in the street, stunned into silence by the sheer, protective force of his love. The vindication was a balm, but it was not a cure. Eliza was shaken, the public dredging of her past leaving her feeling raw and exposed. But as the days turned into weeks, she felt a profound shift. The shame that had been her constant companion for years, the heavy cloak she wore even in Silas's arms, began to feel lighter. It was not gone, but it no longer defined her. The town, for its part, tried to atone. When Eliza next came to the general store, Timothy the clerk gave her a bag of lemon drops on the house. Men tipped their hats with a new, deeper respect, even Mrs. Gable offered a clumsy, stiff-backed apology. She found Eliza outside the church one afternoon. Mrs. Granger, she said, clearing her throat, her face flushed. It appears I was misinformed. My words were hasty. Eliza looked at the proud, unhappy woman. Thank you. Mrs. Gable, I accept your apology. Mrs. Gable nodded, relieved and awkward. I am told you are gathering books for the children. The bank has a crate of old ledgers they are throwing out. The paper is clean. They might be of use for sums. It was a small offering, but it was a beginning. With Silas's blessing, Eliza turned her energy to the school. While the house in the valley was being built, Silas and Jeb now working on it 3 days a week, Eliza started a small class in the church basement. The pastor, moved by the confrontation he had witnessed, offered the space for free. She had 6 students to start, 2 from a nearby homestead, 3 from the ranches to the south, and Tobias, the young ranch hand, who sheepishly admitted he could not read a word and wanted to learn. Eliza thrived. She taught them their letters, their numbers, how to sew a straight seam, and how to read from the worn Bibles and almanacs she had collected. She was patient, kind, and firm. She saw in their bright, uneducated faces a chance to build the future Silas had spoken of. Her bond with Silas deepened into a partnership that was as solid as the land they lived on. They were no longer 2 broken souls, they were architects. They talked constantly. They planned the layout of the new house. They discussed which cattle to sell and which to keep. One evening, sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm bloom over the distant peaks, Eliza spoke a thought that had been sitting on her heart. "Silas," she said softly. He grunted, his chair creaking as he leaned back. "The children in the class," she said, "they are so bright, but there is one, little Maddie. His mother died last year. His father is a good man, but he is lost to drink. Maddie comes to class hungry." Silas was quiet, his face unreadable in the twilight. "I was thinking," Eliza continued, her voice trembling slightly, "the new house will have a spare room. A large one." Silas turned his head to look at her. "I know we cannot replace what we lost," she said, her voice thick, "but there is so much need. I was thinking that maybe, someday, we could take a child in. A child like Maddie. Give him a home." Silas reached out in the darkness and found her hand. He laced his fingers through hers. "I think," he said, his voice rough, "that would be a fine thing, Eliza. I think that would be a fine thing indeed." Later that night, the storm had passed, leaving the air cool and clean. They lay in bed, the moonlight streaming through the open window, painting a silver square on the floor. They had not made love. They had simply been holding each other, talking in low voices, their bodies comfortable and familiar. Silas shifted, propping himself up on one elbow. He looked down at her, his face serious in the pale light. "My mother," he said, his voice soft. "She was a tough woman. She came over the mountains in a wagon, buried 2 children on the trail. She taught me how to read. She taught me that a man's strength is not in his fist, but in what he builds." He reached over to the nightstand and picked up a small, dark object. He pressed it into Eliza's palm. It was a ring. It was not a delicate, glittering diamond from a Boston jeweler. It was a thick, simple band of gold, worn smooth and soft with time, with a single, deep blue sapphire set into it. This was hers. Silas said, "She gave it to me just before she passed. She told me to give it to a woman who was as strong as she was. I gave Mary my grandmother's ring, but this one I saved." Eliza's breath caught. She stared at the ring, the weight of it heavy and warm in her hand. "I have not been strong. Silas, I ran. You never ran from a fight. Eliza, you only ran when you thought you were protecting me. That is the strongest thing I know." He took the ring from her palm. He lifted her left hand. He slipped the gold band onto her 4th finger. It fit perfectly. "I married you in a borrowed dress and with nothing," Silas whispered, his lips brushing her knuckles. "Let me marry you again, right now. With this." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes and streamed down her temples into her hair. He had taken her shame and turned it into honor. He had taken her past and given her a future. She said nothing. She simply pulled his face down to hers and kissed him. It was a kiss that held no desperation, no grief, no hunger. It was a kiss of profound, quiet gratitude. It was a kiss of choice. He made love to her then, slowly, tenderly. It was a reverent act. His hands, which were scarred and calloused from roping and digging, moved over her skin as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. He memorized her body with his touch, his lips, And she met him with an open, giving heart, no longer afraid, no longer hiding. They moved together not as two halves clinging, but as two whole people, finally, completely united. The next morning, Eliza woke with the sun. Silas was already gone, his side of the bed cool. She lay for a moment, looking at the heavy gold ring on her finger. She felt rooted. She dressed and went outside. The air was fresh, and the world felt new. She saw Silas. He was not in the barn. He was in the buckboard wagon, and he was heading south, toward the valley. She ran to the porch. "Silas, wait!" He stopped and waited for her. She climbed up, her heart light. "Where are you going?" she asked, though she already knew. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that lit his eyes. "The ground is still soft from the rain," he said. "It is a good day to break the sod. You cannot have a garden if the land is not prepared." He snapped the reins, and they drove toward their new house, toward the valley, the morning sun on their faces. The new peace was a fragile thing, like the thin crust of ice on a pond in early winter. It held, but the frontier was always shifting beneath it, threatening to crack. The trouble arrived with the summer heat, riding in on the wind in the form of rumors. A gang of rustlers, driven out of the Bighorn Basin, had come south, looking for easy targets. They were led by a man named Cale Maddox, known for taking cattle and leaving burned-out homesteads in his wake. They hit the Miller Ranch first, a small operation 10 miles north. They ran off 50 heads of cattle and shot the family's only dog. The next week, they struck the old Patterson place, taking horses and setting fire to a hay barn. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, settled back over the territory. A meeting was called in Laramie. The ranchers, Silas among them, gathered in the saloon, the air thick with smoke and quiet anger. It was decided a posse would be formed. They would not wait for the sheriff, who was hampered by laws and jurisdictions. They would ride out, hunt Maddox, and end the threat. Silas returned to the ranch late that afternoon. The sun was low, casting long, anxious shadows. Eliza was on the porch of the main house, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. She looked up when she heard his horse, a smile touching her lips. The smile faded when she saw his face. He swung down from the saddle, his movements heavy. "What is it?" Eliza asked, her hand stilling in the bowl. He came up the steps and stood before her, his shadow falling over her. "I have to ride out," he said, his voice flat. "Maddox." "The ranchers are forming a posse. We leave at dawn." Eliza's blood ran cold. She put the bowl down slowly. "A posse. That meant riding into the hills, into a fight." "No," she said, her voice quiet. Silas frowned. "It is not a request. Eliza, it is my land, my neighbors. No, you will not leave me here alone." Silas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I will have Jeb and 3 of the men stay back. You will be safe in the house. Maddox hits herds, not homesteads with men on them." Eliza stood up, the shelled peas scattering at her feet. She put her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I am not Mary. Silas, I am not the woman who waits by the window and prays. I am your wife. I came from nothing. I fought for this life. I will help you guard it." He looked down at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. She was not the shivering woman from the train. She was the woman who had faced down Mrs. Gable, the woman who had survived Arthur Thorne. "It will be dangerous," he said. "This whole world is dangerous," she countered. "You taught me how to shoot the rifle. You taught me how to ride. Let me use what you taught me. Let me stand with you." He wanted to refuse. He wanted to lock her in the house, wrap her in wool, and keep her safe from the world. But he looked at her, at the gold ring on her finger, at the strength in her spine, and he knew he could not. She was not his to hide. She was his to trust. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "You will not ride with the posse, but you will stay at the new house." Eliza blinked. "The valley? It is defendable," Silas reasoned, his mind already working. "The ridges protect the north and west. I will leave Jeb and 2 men with you. They can post up on the high ground, from the house. You can see anyone coming for a mile. Maddox will not expect to stand there. He will go for the main herd and the big house." It was a risk, But it was a smart one. The new house was their fortress, built in the cradle of the valley. That night, they moved their things. They packed food, ammunition, and water into the small, sturdy house. Eliza worked with a calm resolve, her fear channeled into a sharp, clear focus. She packed Silas's saddlebags, her hands tracing the worn leather. They lay in their new bed, in the new house. But they did not sleep. The moonlight streamed in, illuminating the raw, unpainted pine of the walls. "Eliza," Silas said into the darkness, "if they come, you do not fight. You run. You take the mare and you ride east to the river. Do you understand me?" Eliza turned in his arms to face him. "I will not leave our home." He grabbed her, his grip desperate. "This is just wood. Eliza, you are my life. You run. You promise me?" She looked at him, at the terror in his eyes, the same terror he'd had in the shepherd's cabin. "I will be smart," she promised, "but I am not a coward. Silas, I will not let them take this." He kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and gunpowder. He held her all night, as if he could weld her to his side, as if the dawn would not come, but it came. Silas rode out with the posse, a long line of grim-faced men against the red sky. Eliza stood on the small porch of her new house, a rifle in her hand. Jeb and the other 2 men were already in position on the ridge above, their forms small and watchful. The next 2 days were a blur of silence and tension. The valley was preternaturally quiet. Eliza baked, she scrubbed. She tended to the small garden she had started, but every moment, her eyes were on the pass that led into the valley. She cleaned the rifle 3 times. She slept in her clothes, the rifle beside the bed. On the 3rd night, the moon was a sliver, the sky a blanket of stars. Jeb had signaled from the ridge that all was quiet. Eliza was in the kitchen, banking the fire for the night, and then she heard it. It was not a loud sound. It was the skitter of a boot on shale, just outside the house, near the creek. Her heart stopped. She did not breathe. She backed away from the stove, her hand finding the rifle she had leaned against the wall. She checked the load with a silent, practiced motion. She heard a low whisper, "Just a house." Cale said the main ranch was north. Another voice, guttural, "Let us check it. Might be whiskey." A shadow moved past the window. Eliza did not panic. Her mind was ice. She was not the woman who had cried in the cold. She was Mrs. Granger, and this was her land. She walked to the front door, her bare feet silent on the new pine floor. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, planting her feet as Silas had taught her. She heard the scrape of a hand on the door latch. She did not shoot at the door. She did not want to kill. She wanted to be terrified. She aimed high, at the sky above the porch, and pulled the trigger. The explosion shattered the silence of the valley. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, the smell of sulfur filling the room. Outside, a man screamed in surprise. There was a frantic scrambling, curses, the sound of boots pounding on the rocks as they fled. Eliza stood at the door, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. She reloaded the rifle. On the ridge, Jeb and his men, alerted by the shot, began firing into the darkness, their shots echoing hers, making their small force sound like an army. The rustlers did not return fire. They fled, crashing through the brush, their retreat hasty and chaotic. Eliza leaned against the wall, her legs finally shaking. She had done it. She had held the line. Silas returned 2 days later, just after dawn. He was not with the posse. He was slumped over the saddle of his horse, his right arm bound in a bloody shirt. Eliza saw him coming from the pass. She ran from the house, her feet flying over the rocky ground, her heart in her throat. "Silas!" He managed to pull the horse to a stop and nearly fell from the saddle. Eliza caught him, her small frame straining under his weight. "Silas? Oh God, Silas, you are hurt. It is nothing," he gritted out, his face pale and slick with sweat. "A bullet, just a graze." He was lying. It was more than a graze. She helped him into the house, half carrying him, his arm draped over her shoulder. She eased him onto the bed, the mattress they had shared in peace now stained with his blood. "We found them." Silas said through clenched teeth as she ripped his shirt open. "Near the Sweetwater. We scattered them. Maddox is dead." Eliza did not care about Maddox. She looked at his arm. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his shoulder, a ragged, angry wound that was seeping dark blood. She flew into motion. She was not a wife, not a lover. She was a healer. She was a woman possessed. She barked orders at Jeb, who had run down from the ridge. Water, she commanded. Hot, and the whiskey from the crate. And my sewing box. Now. She worked with a fierce, terrifying intensity. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle as she washed away the grime and blood. Silas hissed in pain, but he did not move. He just watched her, his eyes dark with fever and something else. "This will hurt," she said, her voice shaking but firm, as she threaded a needle. "I have had worse." He said, "No, this will hurt me," she whispered. She stitched the wound, her movements quick and sure. She poured the whiskey over the stitches, and Silas arched off the bed with a muffled roar. She bound the arm tightly with clean strips of linen. When it was done, she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands covered in his blood. She was trembling from head to foot. Silas reached out with his good hand and cupped her face. His palm was hot. "You shot the rifle," he whispered. "I heard. Jeb told me." "I did," she said, her voice thick. "You protected the house. I protected our home," she corrected, leaning into his touch, her tears finally falling. She kissed his palm, tasting his sweat and his blood. "I was so scared. Silas," she wept. "I was so scared they had killed you. I cannot do this without you." He pulled her down onto the bed, his good arm wrapping around her, holding her against his chest. "I am right here. Eliza, I am not going anywhere." They lay there for a long time, the feverish heat from his body warming her. They talked about the fragility of life. They talked about the ghosts they both carried. He spoke of Mary, and how he had been too afraid to love again. She spoke of Samuel, and how she had been too afraid to deserve love. They talked about the bullet, an inch to the left, and it would have found his heart. An hour later, the fever might have taken his arm. They talked about how precious every moment was, how quickly the sky could turn from blue to black. "I love you, Silas," she said, the words finally spoken, simple and true, into the quiet of the room. He held her tighter, his lips in her hair. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I have known for a long time." The house in the valley was finished. Silas healed, his strength returning day by day, nursed by Eliza's fierce and unhiding love. As his arm mended, they worked together. He, with his one good arm, built the shelves. She, with her steady hands, chinked the logs with mud and moss. They moved in fully at the end of August, when the aspens on the high slopes were just beginning to turn gold. The big, dark ranch house was left to Jeb in the hands. This small, bright house by the creek was theirs. Eliza began her garden in the rich, dark soil Silas had prepared. She planted seeds she had bought in town, but she also planted the wild seeds she had gathered. Purple lupine, yellow columbine. As she pressed the seeds into the earth, she whispered her son's name. She was not burying Samuel again. She was planting a memory, a hope that life could grow even from the hardest ground. The valley became their sanctuary, and they decided to share it. Eliza organized a picnic. She called it a harvest celebration. Though her garden had only produced a few brave radishes and some herbs, she invited everyone. The homesteaders, the ranchers and their families, the children from her class, and even, after a long hesitation, Mrs. Gable. They came in wagons and on horseback, skeptical at first, but drawn by curiosity and the undeniable fact that the Grangers were the center of the territory. For good or ill, it was a perfect afternoon. The sun was warm, the creek cooled the air, and the valley was a bowl of green and gold. The women, awkward at first, laid out blankets and food, comparing preserved fruits and baked breads. Mrs. Gable brought a stiff, respectable pound cake. Eliza moved among them, a queen in her own small kingdom. She was no longer in rags, nor in a borrowed dress. She wore her simple blue calico, her hair pinned up, her face bright with confidence. The children from her class, including Tobias, sang a song they had learned. Their voices, thin and reedy, echoed off the rock walls, a sound of pure hope as the sun began to dip, painting the clouds in shades of rose and violet. Silas walked over to where Eliza was gathering plates. He took the plates from her hands and set them down. He stood before her, his arm healed, his eyes clear. "I believe. Mrs. Granger," he said, his voice low, a rare, shy smile on his face. "That I owe you a dance, but there is no music." She laughed. Silas whistled. He whistled a high, sweet, slightly off-key waltz, a tune his mother had taught him. He held out his good arm. Eliza took it, and there, in the middle of the valley, surrounded by the townsfolk who had once scorned her, Silas Granger pulled his wife close and danced with her beneath a setting sun. Later, the last wagon had rolled away. The valley was quiet again, the moon rising over the ridge, bathing the new house in silver light. Silas and Eliza walked hand in hand through the new garden, the smell of damp earth and sagebrush rising around them. They were finally, completely, free from judgment. They had faced the town, they had faced the past, and they had faced the wilderness, and they had won. They stopped at the edge of the creek and looked back at the house, a warm, yellow light glowing in the window. Eliza leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. "I thought I was nothing," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "When I stepped off that train, I was just rags and shame, but you made me more." Silas was quiet for a moment. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her waist. He kissed her neck, a slow, warm kiss that made her shiver. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble against her skin. "You were always more, Eliza. I just saw it. Thank you for listening to our story. We hope it brought a little of the Old West into your day. We would be honored if you would let us know where you are listening from and what you thought of Silas and Eliza's journey. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, as we truly love to read them. And if you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories like this one.